Without sensibility, no object would be given to us. Without understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. So we see that for Kant, concepts, the conceptual dimension, is actually the seeing element in experience. For there to be an experience, in contrast to a sensation, to a bare sensation, to the triggering of events in a sensory organ, that is not an experience. For there to be an experience, there must be an experience of something. And for there to be a something, it has to be an entity subsumable under a general class of things, whether it's a chair or a person. So there is a required conceptual framework for experience itself, and it is experience and understanding that together constitute the foundations of all knowledge. Without these concepts, no more than a parade of sensations would take place, and this parade could never rise to the level of a this or a that. Now, I'd not want you to understand this as a species of cognitive relativism. This part of Kant's argument, with appropriate reservations, may be taken to be a chapter in the very anthropology of thought, but not as a species of relativism. And when I say a chapter in the anthropology of thought, recall how frequently Kant reminds us that the argument in place pertains to us, pertains to a creature of a certain kind, pertains to human beings. I think I've mentioned in an earlier lecture that he expresses impatience with those who are impatient with this divide he's established between phenomena and noumena. Doesn't this lead to skepticism? Why indeed can we not comprehend things as in themselves they really are? And Kant is prepared to say, well, imaginably there's a creature that could, but not us, and that people who are impatient with that division are asking, this is very nearly a quote, are asking for the impossible. They're asking for us not to be human beings. So, it's not a relativistic epistemology, but it is an anthropology of knowledge. It presupposes a creature of a certain kind, and that's the only kind Kant can discuss with any authority, and it's the only kind to which Kant's argument can relate directly and with authority. He probably would be interested in that literature that we've spawned in the last 30 years on what it's like to be a bat, but I don't think he'd be interested for long. Now, the manner in which the external world is objectified is according to rules that are at once universal and necessary within the community of rational human beings. This is another way of saying this isn't a relativism that leads to skepticism. The rules that govern the synthesis of the manifold of sensuous content, these rules are universal and necessary. It's conceivable that some different creature might subsume appearances under different rules. That, of course, is not only something we don't know, it's something we couldn't know. The emphasis here is on what is knowable in principle by the sort of creature that we happen to be. So knowledge in the Kantian scheme is an amalgam of sensibility and understanding, such that what cannot in principle enter into experience cannot in principle be known. And so when he says right at the outset that, of course, Hume was right in saying that all of our knowledge arises from experience, that part of Hume Kant has no trouble with at all, and he emphasizes it. He says the mistake Hume made was that in assuming that all of our knowledge arises from experience, our knowledge is grounded in experience. And what Hume failed to appreciate is the necessary elements of cognition that must be in place for there to be experience. and for experience to merge with understanding in a rule-governed way, in such a way as to be generative of knowledge. You know all that. To be known, an object must go beyond an element of experience, and it must be located within a conceptual framework. So what's required now is an argument that establishes the necessity and universality of the pure concepts. How come they're not just haphazard? Required is what Kant refers to as the transcendental deduction of the categories. Now he says not every kind of knowledge a priori should be called transcendental, but that only by which we know that and know how certain representations can be employed or are possible purely a priori. Transcendental in the sense of establishing the necessary enabling conditions for something else to take place. So how do sensations of the most rudimentary sort enter into the formation of concepts? And how does the manifold of otherwise disparate appearances become a unified experience in a given consciousness? Remember, we not only have to get all of this flotsam unified, but it must be unified in a consciousness, and it has to be unified in a consciousness that actually has a street address, so that all this is taking place in you, or you. It's not just out there somewhere. So there has to be a self-consciousness in which all of this somehow takes place. And this has to be achieved without begging the question. Now, I do want to say something I have before on the kind of deduction that Kant has in mind, this transcendental deduction of the categories. I mentioned this to you before. Kant did have an interest. Kant had an interest in everything. He did have an interest in certain political events of the time, jurisdictional disputes, boundary and border disputes in various German principalities and so forth. He didn't make a close study of this. But anyone with an interest in that certainly would have been exposed to what were referred to as Deduction. These are filings, formal filings. Today we talk about them as legal briefs to establish the authenticity of a claim. And that's the sort of deduction he has in mind. He's talking about an argument that a jury would find compelling. In other words, it's not a logical deduction of the categories, it's a transcendental deduction, and the deduction in question is to make out this case. Since we can do such and such, since this happens across all of us, there's no question about it, don't you agree that for this to be the case, that must be the case? For the conceptual lives we live, for the knowledge claims that we routinely make, do you not see that there are certain pure categories of the understanding that must be in place? They must constitute the template, the framework, the necessary conditions for the knowledge we know we have, you see. It's that kind of argument. So he must, he must provide the argument for the conclusion that we are in a position to make objective judgments regarding entities in the external world. And judgment now becomes pivotal. It's the linchpin of the cognitive processes that he's trying to establish. Judgment itself. Urteil. So we see that an experience is of a something. It's not merely a parade of disconnected sensations. There must be a means not contained in the sensations themselves by which these experiences are forged. And Kant says the way to begin an understanding of how this takes place is with two supreme principles. So we now get to the two supreme principles of the first critique. One pertains to sensibility and one pertains to understanding. The supreme principle in relation to sensibility is that the manifold of intuition, quote, should be subject to the formal conditions of space and time. That's the transcendental aesthetic. The necessary enabling conditions for there to be sensibility is a spatio-temporal framework, not in the stimulus. That's something that we bring to the situation. That's the supreme principle regarding sensibility. The supreme principle in relation to understanding is that, quote, all the manifold of intuition should be subject to conditions of the original synthetic unity of apperception. A typical Kantian phrase. You're sitting there as if you had been paralyzed by a poisoned dart. If I say it again, your facial expression will not change one whit. I will prove this by saying it again. The supreme principle in relation to the understanding, listen now, you're Oxford students, meaning nothing gets by you. This will. The supreme principle in relation to the understanding is that, quote, all the manifold of intuition should be subject to conditions of the original synthetic unity of apperception. What's the manifold of intuition? It's all that impinging stuff, you see. Spatio-temporally received, you see. Intuition. Anschauung. This mode of reception. And what has to happen to it? It has to get synthesized. And it has to get unified. I shall give this to you. If it were the States, you could probably put this on Sesame Street. I will give it to you by way of Sesame Street. Part of the manifold of intuition is hot. Another part of it is black. A third part of it is viscous. A fourth part of it is wet. And a fifth part of it is a pungent aroma. Absent the synthetic unity of apperception, you will never get a cup of coffee out of this. Ah, now the eyebrows lower a bit, and the poison has worn off. So we've got to have the synthetic unity of apperception imposed on these sensuous intuition, the manifold of sensuous intuitions, which, by the way, do not come carrying a code for unification. We provide the unification. The external world provides the manifold, otherwise known as, we want a technical term for this, otherwise known as the mess. Right. And out of that, we make a cup of coffee. Constantly on my mind during these lectures, by the way. Now, we're the jury in front of Kant as he argues his case, and we have to judge whether he's made his case for the transcendental deduction of the categories.